Okay, we have to talk. Because ever since I started showing off all the changed and missing effects in Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, all of you have been asking the same thing. And I have just one thing to say to that.
Be quiet!
Because I already addressed this in our first video about all this over 5 months ago.
Previously on GameXplain.
Because as far as I can tell, almost all the missing effects are in fact in the 3DS one too. So that can't be it. See? Okay, now to be fair, we didn't show a whole lot of examples back then, and we have gotten a lot more footage in recent weeks. So I want to settle this once and for all, by taking a closer look at some of the most changed or missing effects I pointed out in our most recent video, and seeing how they stack up in the 3DS version, if they're even there at all. And let's start with the missing sun from Canopy Cannons. So here it is on Wii, here it isn't on Switch, and look, there it is on 3DS! In fact, this scene is a great showcase of how much closer the 3DS version appears to the original Wii version than the Switch version does. Just look at the lighting on the trees or the gradient used for the sunset. We can see the exact same thing in a different level, missing sun and all. Here it is on Wii, here it is missing again on Switch, and sure enough, there it is on 3DS. Although interestingly, the tree line directly in front of where the sun is, or should be, is a little bit too bright on 3DS, whereas the Switch version is actually closer to the original. In either case, this doesn't support the idea that the Switch version is based on the 3DS one. Or perhaps more accurately, that the 3DS version is to blame for it missing. Next, do you remember how I pointed out how big and animated the mud ripples were on Wii? And how small they were by comparison on Switch? Well, once again, we can see that the ripples on 3DS are practically identical to the Wii's. Look, you can barely see them on Switch compared to the other two. Furthermore, as I pointed out before, when the bubbles here pop on Wii, there's a tiny mud eruption. Whereas that doesn't happen on Switch and the bubbles just disappear. But as you can probably guess, the erupting bubbles are in fact there on 3DS. Then, do you remember the skeleton from the Wii version that was missing in the Switch version? Well, guess what? It's also there on 3DS. Another thing we pointed out is how heavy the debris appeared in this scene on Wii as compared to on Switch, where it wasn't nearly as murky. And that was partially for a strange reason, because of how some of the falling rocks would mysteriously disappear before hitting the ground on Switch. Which, surprise surprise, doesn't happen at all on 3DS, and it looks nearly identical to the Wii version. Now the ultimate test might be this lava scene, because the Switch version looked way worse. With the lava's orange color toned down, weird ripples that don't blend as well, and the oddly flat coloring surrounding the pillars sticking out of the lava, on top of several other weird effects. Yet, if we go to the 3DS version, once again we can see that it looks almost identical to the Wii version, as it exhibits none of the problems that we just pointed out. So by now, after all of this, it's pretty clear that the Switch version is not based on the 3DS one, as it wouldn't be missing all those effects that the 3DS version had, right? Well, maybe, but I did notice a couple of odd discrepancies. For instance, take the smoggy background from the Wii here and how it was missing on Switch, making it so you could see through the window in the background, which you couldn't before. Well, as it turns out, the exact same thing happened in the 3DS version. Then there's the fact that Donkey Kong and Diddy both had proper realistic shadows during cutscenes in the Wii version, whereas on Switch they're just round blobs, as they also were on the 3DS. Then, do you remember how I pointed out that the Switch version evidently fixed a mistake in the original game? With the metal plate below the track being moved to the outside. Well, as it turns out, this change was first made in the 3DS version, and has now been carried over to Switch. Interesting. So with most of the missing Switch effects still being found in the 3DS version, and yet while some elements of the 3DS version carry over to Switch, it leaves me thinking only one thing.
It just don't add up!
So here's what I make of all this. First of all, a lot of you owe the 3DS version an apology, because it looks a lot closer to the Wii version than I think a lot of you are remembering. And the vast majority of differences that we pointed out on Switch so far have almost nothing to do with the 3DS version at all. So in a technical sense, it almost doesn't matter whether it's based on the Wii or 3DS versions, as both of them share some really cool effects that are missing from the Switch. And there's several instances of the Switch version seemingly doing its own thing, whether it comes to the lighting, water effects, or even things like the darkened interior of the structure here. Besides all of that, let's assume for the sake of the argument that the 3DS version actually is vastly inferior, and that the HD version is actually based on that, which again, it could still be. So what? That's not an excuse for missing effects. This game is being marketed as Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, not Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D HD. Nor is it Donkey Kong Country Returns HD New Funky Missing Effects Mode. Because when you hear the name Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, one would naturally expect it to be based on either the original or the best version of the game, and not to be missing things that every other version of the game had. If you somehow missed my prior video about all the changed and missing effects, I'll link to it in the description below. All that being said, I don't think Donkey Kong Country Returns HD looks terrible. In fact, I often think it looks quite good, and arguably better in many cases than the original Wii version. But at the same time, I want and expect it to be as faithful as possible to that original version. And it's a bit of a bummer when so many of those tiny touches that made the game as special as it was seemingly aren't translating as well as they should be on Nintendo Switch, especially when they're charging full price. Now of course, the game isn't out yet, and there's still time for them to address these issues before it's actually released, and I hope that they do. As for us, well, we're about done here, so thank you so much for watching. And let me know in the comments what you make of this 3DS comparison. Do you still think it's based on that version? And if it is, does it matter? We'll be reading them, so let us know. And with that, thanks again for watching, click that subscribe button if you haven't already, and we'll catch you next time. Bye everyone!